we're now going to look at some of the history of classification, because humans have been classifying living things for hundreds of years, and the way that we do this classification has changed quite a lot over time. So we're going to start way back at about 300 BC, a couple of thousands of years ago, and this is in ancient Greece, where a famous Greek philosopher called Aristotle, he first started to classify living things. He only came up with two groups though. He thought, let's classify living things as either a plant or an animal. And he based that on, does it move or does it not? And he also looked at the bodies of the living things and he said, does it have red blood or does it not? So this was quite a simple method of classifying living things, but it's one of the earliest examples that we know of people starting to classify living things. Next, we'll move along to the 1740s, about 2,000 years ahead, and this is to a scientist called Linnaeus, and he's one of the most famous scientists to do with classification because he invented taxonomy, which are the 7 levels that we've learnt about. And he invented binomial names, which are the scientific names that we've learnt, the genus and the species. Genus and species name. And again, he only had 2 main kingdoms, just like Aristotle. He only had the plants and the animals. Next, we move along about 100 years to the 1860s, to this scientist called Ernst Haeckel. And he did a little bit more thinking because microscopes had been invented. And he saw that there were some microscopic organisms, and he called them protists. So this is the first time that we now have 3 kingdoms. Haeckel had the plants, the animals, and the protists. Now, the next big breakthrough came in about the 1960s, another 100 years ahead, because we had developed electron microscopes. And these are much more powerful microscopes that can see even within a single cell of a living thing. And when we started looking at cells now with an electron microscope, we saw that some cells didn't have a nucleus. Cells without a nucleus. And we called these cells the prokaryotes, which basically are the kingdom Monera that we've learnt about in our 5 kingdoms. So now this is the first time in the 1960s when we have 5 kingdoms. These are the 5 that we've learnt about: the plants, the animals, and the fungi, as well as the protists and the Monera. Then, moving on to the 1980s, there were a lot of DNA technologies starting to be developed, where we could actually read the sequence of the DNA to compare how closely related different organisms were. And they started thinking in a way called evolutionary thinking, which means we wanted to think about not just the physical features as a way of classifying the living things, not just the physical features, but we wanted to look at how closely related are species. So we started to build dichotomous keys like this one here that aren't just based on common features, but are based on evolution. And these are actually called phylogenetic trees. Phylogenetic trees. And then recently, there's been an even further shift in thinking with scientists, because we're starting to see that there's more than one single tree of life. And the tree of life is just a big phylogenetic tree, or a big dichotomous key, like we can see here. But the main discovery that we found recently is that bacteria actually transfer DNA to other species. And before this, we thought that one species stayed within itself and it never bred with other species. But now we know that actually, even though species might be separate, they still can send DNA to other species, which makes things a lot more complicated. And on top of that, we've now started to consider a level above kingdom, which is the domains. And there are 3 domains, which we call the bacteria, the archaea, and then the eukaryotes. And these 3 domains actually were developed about around the 1980s, and we're still arguing whether they're useful today.